Hi, everyone, and thank you for coming to our third and final webinar in the Nonprofit Management series. My name is Erica Hill, and I'm the Community Arts Development Specialist in our Carson City office. I am pleased to welcome today, for our third time, our guest speaker, Dr. Jessica Word, Assistant Professor at the School of Public Policy and Leadership at UNLV. I'll be assisting in the chat and Q&A features, and we'll open up the webinar at the end for any verbal comments and questions. Today's webinar will be recorded and available with all the additional resources on our YouTube channel. On behalf of everyone at the Nevada Arts Council, I would like to thank you all for attending these webinars. And thank you again, Jessica, for facilitating and providing such a great resource for our communities. Without further ado, I will let you take it away on this Monday.
All right, happy Monday, everybody. I've gotten used to every other week seeing y'all on Monday, so. So next slide. Anyway, so today we're going to talk about really building your organization's reach and visibility in the community. Every other talk has been a little bit about building the capacity and infrastructure and even getting your tax status. And so this one is really about how do we look outside of our organization. Next slide. All right, so our talk today will have four major sections. The first is community outreach. This part of our talk will deal with how we're going to increase the number of people who know about and are engaged in our organization, usually through face-to-face interactions or personal contacts. The second section will deal with how we communicate through the media or at the crowd level. The third section will deal with the special issue of interacting with government at all levels, the legal issues involved with that as a nonprofit, because there's some specific things about our tax statuses that can be impacted, and some of the restrictions on those interactions and when and why you should still consider doing it anyway. The final topic we'll talk about today is fundraising. And the reason we end with that topic is that many of those earlier sections lay the groundwork for better fundraising success or building other financial supports for your organization. Next slide. So nonprofits are all about community building. Really, they are sort of part of the infrastructure of our communities and are sort of an indicator of social capital at the community level. And it's really at the center of what we do. However, diving into these things at first can seem really overwhelming. And so often outreach is sort of our first step in terms of building our reach. So let's talk a little bit about the difference between outreach and engagement. Outreach is about getting the word out about your organization and what you can provide to the community. So if you provide services for a fee or performances, it can be a key part of building your audience or gaining additional participants in programming. Outreach is usually transactional and goal-oriented, so it's about getting more people to your events. So, for example, in Las Vegas, we have First Fridays that goes down on downtown in the Arts District. How do we get more people to First Friday? It might be part of our outreach strategy. That could be more vendors, that could be more of the public, etc. So it's kind of almost a marketing purpose. Engagement is really different. It's a longer term investment in building relationships and capacity in the community. So it isn't just, in my case, how can UNLV get more grants or dollars, but it's how can I work with the community to achieve our common goals? This would be one of the things I could point to as a form of engagement. In other words, what assets can I bring to the community and how can I engage the assets the community has in place for a longer term win for both of us? So what are the things we can do together and how can we build those relationships? And the reason to do both outreach and engagement is really to gain additional community interaction and build the organization's network. So this can hopefully help you find additional volunteers because people who don't know about you are unlikely to volunteer, right? You want to make a good first impression, get people involved at the ground level, have them sort of know about your organization on your terms. Get more clients engaged. So if you're trying to get more participants in your programming, again, engagement and outreach are key to that. The other thing is around what we're going to talk about later, advocacy and education. Again, you want people to know what your organization is and what it does, and why it's important to the community. And then donors. So donors, again, aren't likely to give to you if they don't know you exist. So one of the first things is sort of building your brand, is having them know who you are and associate you with the events and the good programming that you're doing, and getting people to start to see the impact and the role of your organization. Finally, if you've ever heard the expression, it's not what you know, it's who you know. This is true in building external relationships as well. You never know when a connection will come in handy, but you want to balance building relationships with getting things done. So again, there's still a cost to building relationships. It still takes time away from you and your staff. So you don't want to go to every networking event and engage and put engagement at the center unless it's really part of what you do. But you also want to be strategic about it. Think about ways you can reach the people you need to reach. So if there's a particular funder you're wanting to meet, you want to think about the networks you already have, whether that's your board members or other people, and how to get to them and where you might be able to meet those people, and build those relationships. Because again, it's all about starting that conversation with your agency or your organization and beginning to build that first impression. Okay, next slide. Okay, so volunteer recruitment and retention. So volunteers, again, especially for smaller organizations, can be the lifeblood of what you do. So many organizations are small and run with just volunteers or mostly volunteers and maybe just a few staff. So let's talk about recruiting volunteers in particular. First and foremost, establish expectations for both you and your staff. If you have staff, make sure that everybody understands what the role of the volunteer is, what you expect them to do, and then also treat their time as valuable. So only bring them if you have something for them to do, and make sure that you thank them for that time. Make sure that they understand the impact that they're having. And then be consistent with your tone and message. So if you need volunteers, make sure that they understand what they're going to be doing and when they're going to be doing it, and include volunteer outreach communications and recruitment materials in lots of places. So if you're doing a table at some other organization's event, and it's just an outreach event, you can also have a place to sign up, not just for clients, but also for volunteers. Because again, people at all different socioeconomic levels and statuses and backgrounds volunteer. And often it's just about being asked at the right time or finding something that connects to them personally. The other thing that's really important is training volunteers. There's this kind of idea that volunteers are free and they just show up and they do wonderful things, and that's sort of true. But the way to make the most of your volunteers is to really think about what do they need to be successful when they are at your organization. Again, training doesn't have to be a really involved process unless they're doing something really complex. But nothing is worse than showing up to a volunteer event and having no idea who to talk to, what you're supposed to be doing, or when you're supposed to be doing it, or what the expectations are. If you've ever had a first day on a job where nobody sort of trained you and they just expected you to jump into it, that's the same feeling volunteers have when they show up and nobody's trained them or told them what they need to do. The other thing is make sure that to have a staff or a more experienced volunteer available and introduce that person so they know who to go to for help. Because again, one of the things that turn volunteers off really quickly and can lose a volunteer is having a bad experience. And so building those connections to staff and to, like I said, more experienced volunteers can really help them build those relationships. Again, volunteers come not just because they care about your cause, although that may be the first reason they get involved. They also come to build friendships and personal contacts. Volunteers will come back more often if they like the people they're working with, and they have a connection to both the staff and the clients and the agency, right? We all want to feel connected, especially after the last couple of years that we've kind of lost that feeling of connection for lots of us. And really these people kind of become their colleagues or their coworkers when they're at your, when they're volunteering. So having those connections can make a huge difference in a rough day going okay. Like Erica here helping me out today. Volunteers with strong relationships come back again and again and continue volunteering. And the other thing is to think about how do we build upon their successes? Like, how do I give a great volunteer who's been doing the same role over and over again more responsibility? How do I let them sort of grow into a new role? How do I develop them? Sort of the same way I would develop staff and think about how do I want to promote them or help or give them leadership responsibility. The other thing people forget about with volunteers, sometimes amazing volunteers sometimes go on to be amazing board members. Or it's a good way to sort of start to think about, you know, if this person has the capacity to move into a board role or to serve on what we call board committees. So maybe you have an amazing fundraising committee that's led by board members, but you want some more bodies on that committee, and having a really committed volunteer group that's willing and able to sort of grow in that role and be part of that can be a huge asset. It can also help keep your board members from getting burned out. Having support, even if it's volunteer support. The other thing is to talk about how important they are. So communicate the impact of volunteers to your agency. If you couldn't do without your volunteers, make sure they know it. Thank them. It doesn't have to be a big gift or a big whatever. Just saying thank you or writing a thank you note after the event can make a huge difference. They want to make sure that they're not just there filling a seat or feeling like an interchangeable cog. Just like a great employee, you want to tell them what a great job they did. A great volunteer should feel the same. The other thing that nobody talks about with volunteers is that sometimes volunteers become donors. If they are investing their time, which we all know time is sometimes way more scarce than money, then they also might be willing to give to your agency. And again, this is something that you can see having a great volunteer experience as a form of cultivation, especially if you start thinking about using volunteers in other ways. We often think of volunteers as sort of these entry-level positions, but you can also do what we call high-skill volunteering, which I won't talk a ton about today. It's a whole class into itself. But high-skill volunteering is taking like somebody's professional skills and applying to your nonprofit. So maybe you have a great person who's been volunteering at your event, but they're a social media person. And how can maybe you tap into that skill set for your agency? Now, again, it's important to match what they want with what you're asking them to do. So maybe they don't want to do that since they do that all day at work for your agency, but maybe they do. Maybe they have some great ideas about how you can move your social media to the next level. All right, next slide. All right, public relations and social media is our next area. So public relations is really about how do we project our message into the community. I think I'm out of order here a little bit, so we'll talk about social media first. Actually, can you go to the next slide, Erica? I feel like somehow the slides have gotten mixed up. All right, let's get started with social media first. I think I accidentally have a duplicate that got moved around. So public relations for nonprofits can help define the organization and help us reach a larger audience. And it's about this sort of mass media level of outreach. And what we want to do is, again, give everybody an understanding of what our organization does and who we benefit and why we benefit. So part of what we want to do when we're thinking about a public relations campaign is really define the goals of our campaign. Again, I always think it's really important to think about what the successful end looks like when we're getting started with something, and that helps us plan and know when we've done a good job. And so we want to think about what's our audience, whether that goal is just more awareness of our mission, whether it's increasing the number of donors, whether it's increasing the number of volunteers, because again, that's going to sort of define how we go through the outreach process and what our ask is. For example, last Friday was Go Red for Women Day, which is put on annually by the American Heart Association. I have their logo down here in the corner. And they've successfully branded this campaign and used it for advocacy about women's heart health every year. And they've done this by being really consistent about their message. They know who their audience is. Their target audience is women, healthcare providers, so the general public, and even decision makers. So thinking about how do we get more funding to support women's heart health research and things. And so if you think about how successful this campaign is, if you've turned on any news show on Friday, almost all the newscasters were wearing red, and they were talking about it being Women's Heart Health Month, and that it was Go Red for Women Day, right? And this has been building over years. So they didn't go from, starting their campaign to having national media attention every year. But what they did is, I'm sure, started by building and cultivating networks with local media first, and sort of rolling that up to sort of the state and the national level, and doing outreach in different ways. So doing it through social media, doing it through news contacts. I know that in the years past, they've also had some luncheons and some other things where they talk about heart health here locally. And I'm sure they did this at the national level as well. So if you think about every local American Heart Association chapter going through these media outreach strategies and having this branded message, that helps magnify the impact. And that's sort of what we've tried to do here in the state with Nevada's Big Give and some of these other things where we're trying to build the profile of the sector overall as well. But some important things to remember: you want to make sure the branding of the particular event is consistent with your branding. So you want to make sure, so for example, with this, the American Heart Association's logo is red and it's a heart. This logo sort of calls back to that, right? It's also red. It also sort of ties in with their overall message. And I'm sure they also started really locally by asking individuals to wear red that day, to talk about heart health among women. And so you can see how you can build upon these little things. You can also build upon sort of adverse events. If you think about what's been happening at the NFL, and they've also been talking about heart health and CPR. And again, I think the American Heart Association has been really smart with that. I'm blanking on that football player's name all of a sudden. But they've had him going on social media and doing media campaigns about the importance of learning CPR. And again, this all goes back to their core mission of saving people's lives and raising awareness around heart health. And so even adverse things can help you build your brand as long as you're sort of prepared for that. Okay. Now let's go to the next slide. There we go. For some reason, it's in here twice. As we said, it's a very Monday. Okay, so social media is one of the cheapest, easiest routes to start building your brand. And it's where a lot of organizations really start now. It used to be really intimidating, but I think a lot of us through personal years have gotten really used to using social media. But one of the things that's important to know about social media is the landscape is always changing and evolving. Consider the current debate about TikTok, which may lead to it being blocked in the United States. So that may impact your social media strategy with TikTok. So one of the first things you want to think about is who's going to be in charge of the social media. If you don't have a communications person, maybe you take pieces and give it to each person. Maybe your fundraising person is in charge of it at fundraising events around development and fundraising. Maybe your program manager is going to tweet about impact. And so you want to really think about who's the best position to tell those stories. And then you want to make sure that you do it consistently and often enough. So for example, sometimes, nonprofits go out of business. One of the ways I sometimes check to see if they're still around is, have they posted anything lately, or how recently has their social media been updated? If it's been over a year, I start to worry that they're not around anymore. So you want to make it sort of part of your regular schedule, and to tweet every Monday. If you again, our local news station every Monday does a thing on Make-A-Wish Monday. I'm sure Make-A-Wish here locally also has a Twitter piece about it. They also post on Facebook about it. They also post, and you can do this through, there are some social media apps like Hootsuite, where you can actually post on multiple platforms at the same time. But again, you want to think about the best placement for some of these things. So if you want to do something with video that's short, TikTok, right? If you want to live stream an event like this, Facebook Live, or doing a webinar on Zoom is a better platform. So you want to think about sort of matching the platform to what you're trying to do. If it's a really visual thing, maybe we're going to talk about Instagram, right? And I'm sure I'm leaving out 12 new ones that my nephew knows about and my niece knows about, but I'm unaware of, right? I keep my 9-year-old off social media. The other thing is, you want to make sure that messaging is consistent with your mission of your organization. You want to set up a nonprofit account. And the reason to set up a nonprofit account is that there are special advantages to having a nonprofit account. That often mean that you get to add donate here buttons, you get special training, lower cost access to advertising, and some of these other things. In fact, Google even does grants where you get special advertising or free advertising rates that you can apply for. And from what I understand, it's a pretty easy entry level grant. So if you have a big event coming up, you might want to look at Google Grants as a way to get out the message, because again, people Google things before they go to them, right? And so you want that to pop up. What's going on this weekend in Elko, or what's going on in Reno. So think about those nonprofit accounts. And again, I looked, and there's lots of free trainings also available for nonprofits on social media for each of these platforms as well. And so these are specific things that these organizations are granting to you that you might as well take advantage of. And it also means that you've locked down your organization's name, and it prevents other people from doing it and committing fraud in your name. Because that's another big risk of social media, is that people will set up sound-alike or similar sounding accounts trying to take advantage of your goodwill in the community. So you also want to sort of monitor social media, even if you don't participate in it, make sure nobody's pretending to be your organization. And it's not like this didn't happen in the past, where people would, pretend to be from your organization and go and collect donations. It's just easier to actually see and find on social media. So you want to really pay attention to these things, because again, this could damage your reputation and cause issue with those donors, particularly if they think they're giving to you and they're not really. This happens a lot, particularly in the areas of veteran organizations. There seem to be a lot of sound-alike and look-alike organizations that are actually fraudulent. So I don't think it's happened as much in the arts, but again, it's something to sort of pay attention to and monitor. The other thing is, think about your employees in terms of social media, and having a social media guideline in their employee handbook. So when are employees allowed to post? What are they allowed to post? With respect to volunteers and paid vendors and consultants, you should really think about having clear policies for them about when and how they should post, whether they can use your organization's logo, how they can use that logo. Again, these are assets of your organization, and it's hard to think of something that's digital as an asset, but they are really important and can have actually really great brand value. And that's what we'll talk a little bit about this in the fundraising section. And you also want to make sure you copyright those brands. Again, it's a little bit of an expense, but again, it can go a long way to protecting you and your organization's reputation. Okay, next slide. Okay. My social media thing just got all screwed. Okay. So let's talk now about advocacy and lobbying, which is a specific type of public relations. Advocacy is much broader than we usually think it is. A lot of nonprofits say, I can't do advocacy and lobbying. That is absolutely not true. I will tell you exactly what you're not allowed to do, but advocacy is not lobbying unless you're discussing specific legislation. So unless you're talking about NRS bill number 281 and asking somebody to vote a particular way, it's not lobbying. Okay. So to constitute lobbying, it must be specific, which means either proposed or pending law or bill, distinct from addressing a broad policy issue. With regard to ballot initiatives, a proposal, so say in California, there's a lot of ballot initiatives that end up in public relations and social media campaigns by nonprofits, in particular human services usually, that can start to constitute lobbying because, again, it's a specific thing that we're asking people to do something about. But usually most things nonprofits do are advocacy and not lobbying. And I was actually a lobbyist / advocate in the state of Florida, so trust me, I know. Most of what we didn't count as lobbying, so we didn't have to count it. So it's really, advocacy is about educating the public. And that includes government officials and elected officials. So if you're dealing with something that's really important, like arts and education, which has been shown to decrease student stress, to increase student engagement, and you want to make lawmakers understand why cutting arts programming and arts funding is important without talking about a particular bill or the budget, that's advocacy. Okay? So most of what we're going to do is going to be advocacy. So you can also publish nonpartisan analysis. There's lots of national and state groups that deal with advocating for the arts. You can use and tweet and repost those findings as part of your advocacy, right? And again, you want to make sure that that's good research that's published by reputable sources. But again, that is not lobbying. Discussing broad social issues without mentioning specific legislation, again, advocacy, not lobbying. So why do we care about early childhood education? Why do we care about the arts? What's the benefit of the arts in general? Those are all advocacy. The financial impact of the arts. The other thing that can be seen as advocacy is also, building these relationships with local government officials around so they understand what your agency does. And again, if you want to be successful as a lobbyist, you have to build those relationships just like you're building relationships with donors and the public ahead of time. You don't want to wait until there's a bill or a law that could impact your organization. You want to do it beforehand. Because if you just show up in their office that day, they're not going to listen to you. You want to be familiar to them. You want to be somebody they already have encountered. And hopefully in a positive way. So, all right, now let's move on to lobbying, which is the one that scares nonprofits the most. So next slide. Okay, so Lobbying is really, again, about specific legislations, specific regulations that are impacting your organizations. And there's really two types of lobbying. The first is what we call direct lobbying, which is a communication to a legislator or their staff about specific legislation. Be really impactful, but again, they know that you're there for that particular thing and to represent your agency. A more powerful thing to do is actually what we call grassroots lobbying, which is where you ask the public to communicate with their elected officials and ask them to either oppose or support legislation. Again, this is considered lobbying, so if you're spending some resources, you want to make sure that you are thoughtful about that. But there's lots of examples, even in the arts, where this can be really important. So for example, my cover slide today was a picture from Burning Man a couple of years ago. Burning Man had a lot of issues with the federal government and the Park Service and BLM around putting on their events. And one of the things they did to help control their costs to make sure that they could be successful in the long term is actually hire a lobbyist. Again, I had to think about, like, what are some examples of arts lobbying? But once I started looking, there are actually a ton of them. Because arts can be controversial, they can be challenging to people in power, right? And so lobbying and advocacy is actually a natural part of the arts, I would say. And so Burning Man actually, some of the lobbying and advocacy they did was around the rules. So if you haven't worked in this field, you may not even know what rules are. But so legislation, when it's passed, is passed at a really high level because they can't create all these details, and because they would never get anything passed. Laws would be thousands of pages long. And so what they do is they delegate some authority to the agencies that actually implement laws and policies. And that delegation is usually called rulemaking authority. And so that's another place where you can advocate and lobby, is with the decision makers in the individual agencies. So say a law got passed and it could be beneficial or it could be detrimental to your agency, but it's written really broadly. So one of the things you want to do is reach out to the staff people in those agencies about the rulemaking and trying to make sure that those rules are as beneficial as they can be to your agency. Again, there's not 1,000 examples of this in the arts. Most of it will be around funding. But for Burning Man, it was about, like, what's allowable? How do we, how expensive should it be to do environmental mitigation after a big event? What's a reasonable expense for the Park Service to charge them for use of the desert once a year, right? And it's a huge money-making event that has a huge economic impact in Reno and Carson. So part of their advocacy, I'm sure, is also reaching out to decision makers in Reno and Carson and the state about the value of this event to the state of Nevada, not just the value of it to them, right? All right, next slide. Okay, this is about what we're not allowed to do as a nonprofit. There's a few really bright lines set aside under IRS rules and regulations. Here, see what I said? Like I said, rulemaking authority is important. You cannot directly endorse or oppose a political candidate. Okay, you can't say our nonprofit supports X person. That is not allowed. You can publish, and again, this gets a little blurry. You can publish like a vote record where X voted in favor of the arts funding and Y voted against it. But it has to be somewhat balanced. So the other thing to be careful about is giving awards, particularly new awards during election season or election years, because that can come off as an endorsement. So say you want to give, Arts Legislator of the Year award, and you've created it and it's brand new, And obviously election season is coming up for that person. That person's up for re-election during this calendar year. Maybe you want to wait a year. And again, once those things are established, it's easier to do them annually without it feeling like you're trying to endorse somebody. But you want to think about the optics of this. The other thing you can't do as a 501c3 nonprofit is engage primarily in political activities. It can't be your main mission. You can spin off an organization that's separate and incorporate it as a 501c6. There are nonprofits here in the state that have both 501c3s and 501c6s. I think it's pretty common in environmental nonprofits to have a C3 and a C6. So the C3 delivers the programming. People can make contributions to the C3 and write those off their taxes. The C6, those contributions are non-tax deductible. When I was a lobbyist, I worked for a C6 for the Florida Coalition Against Domestic Violence. That's where I worked. And we were basically supported each of the domestic violence shelters around the state. And again, Florida is a really populous state, right? One of the top 5 states population-wise in the country. Basically paid dues into the Florida Coalition Against Domestic Violence for the advocacy and lobbying work we did annually. So that advocacy took place at like every level, down to police stations. Because again, we wanted police to understand, how they could be helpful in domestic violence situations, what their role was, what the dangers they faced were. And eventually we even got the police lobbying group to partner with us, because one of the most dangerous things you can do as a police officer is to enter a domestic violence situation. So we had them on our side too, after a couple of years of advocacy and outreach. So there's ways to build partnerships that are kind of unexpected as well when you do this work, because people can see sort of the mutual benefit. The other thing as a nonprofit you cannot do is make political contributions out of your nonprofit account. You cannot write a check. You also cannot share your mailing list, because again, that is an asset and it can be seen as a gift to that candidate. And again, especially local candidates may not know all these laws and rules, so it's important that you know those laws and rules so that you don't accidentally run astray. Operate outside the IRS guidelines. Again, make sure that you review those. Sometimes they get updated. There are even test cases that happen probably about every year. A church in particular seems to endorse a candidate from the pulpit. The IRS then goes through the process of deciding whether to revoke their tax status or not. It's this testing of this separation of church and state thing that happens almost every election cycle. So make sure that you review those guidelines. Again, in the handout, there's a link to all the legal pieces that we're talking about here. But in terms of your overall budget, in terms of advocacy and lobbying, basically, as long as you're spending at under 10% at almost any budget level, that's going to be fine. Once you get over that, you want to think about what we call a 501H election, which is a safe harbor election for lobbying and advocacy. Now, and there are also exceptions. So if there's a piece of legislation or a legal change that could impact your ability to survive and continue as an organization, then actually you end up, you can spend all your money. So say the Supreme Court's decision on Roe v. Wade would have outlawed all sexual health planning and things in the entire country, right? And it would have changed the law to the extent that there was nothing that Planned Parenthood could do legally. They could literally spend every penny of their budget defending themselves. Again, those are pretty rare exceptions, and even now, that's not where they're at. They actually have a C6 that does the work of the advocacy and the lobbying. That's separate. But just to give you kind of a newsworthy example of when that might actually happen, it's again pretty unlikely that would happen, but it is something that you should be aware of. Okay, So now probably what everybody wants to talk about, fundraising. Oh, rights of individuals for advocacy and lobbying. Okay, so the other thing that's important to know is that people who work for your agency, including you, even if you're the executive director or the president of the board, have rights as political freedom of speech operatives, right? So you can participate on behalf of candidates. You as an individual can endorse a candidate. You can even reference your connection with your nonprofit for identification. So you can say, I'm the board president of, but you have to make it clear that it's you as an individual. So you can't use your agency email. If you have a .org email, you can't use letterhead, and you can't ask the organization to issue statements on behalf of candidates. In fact, I actually got this email from UNLV today, because today is the start of the legislative session, saying it's okay to advocate on behalf of yourself as a state employee, but you cannot use your UNLV email. And you can't use your desk phone. And you can't use, if you have a UNLV cell phone, you can't use that. You must use your private resources only. Because again, even state agencies have lobbying laws and restrictions, and they're very similar to the ones that govern nonprofits. And a lot of these laws come from the idea that one of the biggest supporters of nonprofits is government, and so there's a little bit of a conflict of interest, and so that's why there's sort of these bright lines and rules. But there are really important reasons to do this. Again, things that can be really impactful for your agency. And there's some evidence from California that shows that organizations that advocate actually get money back on that investment, either through additional state funding or local funding, and then also just better awareness of what they do and why that's important. That can lead to at least protecting themselves from negative changes that could damage their missions, right? And so there are these real reasons to do this. Like I said, Burning Man is a good arts example that they were having a real hard time working with the Bureau of Land Management on their annual event, and some of the restrictions that were being placed on them were making it really expensive and difficult. And so doing that so at that point, hiring a lobbyist was a good investment. But again, most of the stuff that you can do on your own. And you can register as a lobbyist in the state of Nevada. I think it's a couple $100. If you actually want to go into the legislative building during session, you have to register as a lobbyist and pay. All right, fundraising. Like I said, I feel like this is the thing everybody wants to hear, but all the things we talked about up to this point can really be part of our fundraising as well. If we're doing advocacy in the community and showing leadership on it, our particular thing, that can get the attention of donors. If we're doing PR and marketing, if we're showing our impact on social media, all these things can help us with our fundraising. So in terms of just getting started, and again, I know most of you probably are past this point, but it never hurts to talk through the basics for anybody who's new or has a new nonprofit. The first thing is to really set a goal and identify the need that goal is going to fund. I've talked to nonprofits and I'm like, well, how much are you looking to raise? And they can't answer that question. And that is going to make a donor uncomfortable. I just want to raise money. That's not an answer. Make sure that you know how much it's going to cost to get to fund the need that you're wanting to fund, and have a clear goal in mind. And again, you might talk to a donor who can actually fund the whole thing. Happens on occasion. There's some really wealthy people in the state. So you want to have that goal in mind and be clear about the impact of meeting that goal. And then the next thing is to really think about where you could possibly get support. Is it a mix of grants, individual donors, corporations? Are there ways that we can bring down the dollar cost through in-kinds and other asks. So maybe we're building a building, maybe we can ask the contractor to do part of the building as an in-kind donation. So thinking sort of creatively about how we can meet that need, and whether it all has to be dollars is also a way to think about it as part of your overall fundraising. The other thing is set a timeline for that goal. Again, if you're doing a capital campaign, you want to think about it usually in about a 3 to 5 year, depending on the economy. But again, campaign should have beginnings and ends, and then setting guideposts for what success looks like every quarter or every piece of that campaign. The next thing is really to start building those relationships with the individual who can help you reach that goal, whether, again, that's building relationships with a grant maker who will actually help you by granting money. Again, the first time a grant maker sees an application for a grant shouldn't be the first time they've heard of your agency. You should have met with them, cultivated that relationship as well. And by cultivate, I just mean build. So again, making people aware of who you are, what you do, and why what you do is important and valuable to the community. The other thing is then to start actually asking for money. And again, you want to, we'll talk a little bit about these details more in the next section. But when you approach a donor or a funder, you want to have a particular dollar amount in mind and what the impact of those dollars could be, right? And then the other thing that's so important, no matter what size donor you're soliciting from, thank them, follow up with them, continue engaging them. Because the other thing that I've heard from fundraisers over the years is that you never know who's going to be a big donor or who's going to leave you money in their will or surprise you with a donation. And so sometimes those small dollar donors will leave you a bequest. So you want to cultivate the relationship with people at every level. Or maybe they're connected to somebody important that you don't know what their connections are, right? Okay, so next slide. Okay, so different sources of support that we want to think about. Individual small donors. So these are, again, people that we can kind of ask en masse, things like setting up a QR code in an event that's kind of an outreach event. Or if you're doing a gallery walk as part of your outreach mission, you can put a donation jar at the check-in table where you give out the maps and ask for a $5 donation to cover the cost of the map. You can also, and again, you want to be specific about what you're asking for and why you're asking for it. You can ask people, again, on social media to fund a particular need, like a new kiln for a pottery studio, or ask people to donate the cost of a seat or a ticket for a school group. So thinking about who we're asking and what's the right level to ask of that audience is also important. So if it's a brand new donor, our ask is probably going to be smaller. And again, we want to make sure that we're asking for an amount that makes sense for them, right? And then clearly communicate the need for that money. Like I said, tying it to a particular outcome or impact that they can have, and the difference that donation can make. Other ways to involve individuals is to post wish lists of items. Again, thinking about in-kind support as well as monetary support, which can be done. Lots of agencies here create Amazon wish lists around the holidays particularly for clients or for their agencies, where people can literally go in, add things to their shopping cart and ship it right to the agency. Or our local youth homeless group does gift card drives for their clients. So they ask for Amazon gift cards, they ask for fast food gift cards, etc. And that's all part of their wish list. You could post that on your website. And again, as an arts organization, that may include things like art supplies, things that are sort of part of your daily activities. And it could also be wish lists of volunteer hours or volunteer needs, right? Your wish list could include somebody to teach a craft class on Thursdays. Because again, you never know who's going to step forward to say yes to that. The next group of individuals is large individual donors. And these are big players who are much more sophisticated, so you want to know more about them and make sure that that ask is really particular to them. And make sure that you understand how you connect to them and how your mission could impact them and what your agency brings to them and what they want to see in the community. So focused on their goals and needs and not just yours. The next group is public funders. Again, this usually comes through RFPs, request for proposals. There's usually not an easy way to reach out to government, ask for money outside of them sort of presenting the opportunity to you. But it is something you want to, make sure that you're monitoring these and paying attention to them, because you never know when your agency might be a good match. The other thing here is to make sure you apply for things strategically. Don't just apply for everything. Apply for things where the ask makes sense for your agency and is part of your mission. Okay, corporate contributors. Again, often these are great places to start with event sponsors, asking corporations to buy tables or to sponsor the food. In Nevada, we often have casino partners who are willing to donate a space for an event if they're asked in the right way, right? Corporate foundations are usually also part of this discussion. They usually give dollars versus in kind, but they also usually have an RFP or some sort of structured way in which you apply for funds for them. Those are usually annual or semi-annual, and usually each corporate foundation has like particular giving areas. So again, you want to be strategic and not approach corporate foundations that don't give to your area or don't give to your mission. Or if you don't fit their funding criteria. I actually have trained some of the casino foundations around like going through grant applications, and one of the first things we do is talk about like rating it based on how well it meets the criteria for their own funding, right? Private foundations and trust, again, also usually have a criteria for what they're looking for to give. I can't believe I'm actually going to run out of time today. I always underplan, apparently. So we'll go over a couple minutes here. And then galas and events. Again, a good way both to sort of thank people and also maybe to expand the network of your donors. Can we have the next slide? Because we're going to talk a little bit more about galas and events. Oh, okay. Again, when you're putting together an event, particularly a fundraising event, you want to, again, think about it. Is it part of our brand? Is it on brand? Does it make sense with what we're doing? If we're an arts event, how does it engage the arts? Will it be fun and engaging? Nobody wants to put on a fancy dress and go and have an unfun time. Or are there ways that we can make it more accessible and broaden it out and still get those big dollar donors in the door? Maybe a VIP area for the big dollar donors. The other thing is that we want to make sure that we're going to do the event well. You don't want to have an event that doesn't come together well, that isn't engaging. So making sure that we have enough resources to put it on, that we can gain enough support from the community to pull it together well. Thinking about the timing of the event. If I want to have it outside in Southern Nevada, we're not going to do that in the summer. Probably not. If I want to have it outside, we're probably not going to do that in Reno in January, right? Too much snow, unless it's a snow event. But we want to think about also what are the other events that may be competing with our events at that time of year. So you also want to think about holidays, religious observances, etc., and making sure that we're not putting our date on the same date as other events that could compete for that attention. Make sure that it will cover the costs, be worth the trouble. So you almost want to do like a mini business plan for your events. project how much it's going to cost to put it on, and then how many people you actually have to get in the door to make it worthwhile. And then think about ways to enhance revenue at the event. So things like add-ons like silent auctions, VIP areas, special, if you're performing arts, special access to artists for those VIP groups. Like, how do you upcharge people? Wine polls are a fun way to do it. Again, if you're doing fine art like painting or sculpture, maybe we can auction off some pieces, even if it's a student level thing, or kids. I've seen those go really well actually at events. Okay, next slide. Trying to get close to being on time here. The other thing that it's important to do, and we talked about this last time, is engaging your board. And I think a lot of boards are really scared to do this because, again, they're volunteers and they may have never done fundraising before. And so you want to make sure that as they join their board, you are clear about your expectations in terms of fundraising. And usually that's through a give or get policy. You want to provide support by training them. So bringing in your fundraising staff, or if you have a fundraising consultant on the outside, and having them sort of prepare them and help them work through those fears around asking people for support. Again, it's a hard thing to do. It's like asking for help for yourself. And again, there's some fears that, if I ask my friend for money, they're going to ask me for their nonprofit they're on the board for. Those are real fears. So talking about them and unpacking them and really thinking through them. Engage them in cultivation. So it's not necessarily that they always have to do the ask. Sometimes they're just going to introduce you to somebody in their network that you don't have access to. Again, thinking about who you need access to can be really important. And often maybe your board member doesn't know that person, but they know the person who knows that person. So thinking about ways to help to engage them, not just in the asking part, but also the cultivation piece, or building the relationship. So having them invite people to events or inviting them to learn more about things. If they're really uncomfortable with asking, send staff with them to ask. So maybe they're just doing the introduction, and then personalize their role to their skill set and their financial resource level, right? So I serve on some boards. I'm a state employee. I don't have a big checkbook. I do make a donation, but it's in line with my ability to give. And then I also do a lot of in-kind donation, because again, I have expertise that maybe other people don't have. So my give may be in services versus dollars, but I also usually make a dollar contribution, because again, some funders really look for how much of your board participates in giving and fundraising, because that shows a level of commitment and engagement of your board. Okay, last thing. Okay, the last thing you want to do, especially with those high dollar donors, is what we call prospect or donor research, and that's where we're trying to identify people with the capacity to give. So the people who have incomes to support giving. Again, if you're looking at me as a board member, I don't have that much capacity. I have some. Compared to Elaine Wynn, nothing. When we think about some of the really high value or high net worth individuals in our state, there are a lot of them that have lots of capacity. The capacity isn't enough because they only have so much time and attention. You also want to look for what we call affinity. So do they have a relationship with the arts? Have they given to similar organizations in the past? Is there some other thing that they support that has a tie into what you do? So for example, when the Smith Center was being opened here in Las Vegas, the building, the money for the building had been raised. They reached out to Elaine Wynn. We actually did an event with Elaine Wynn where she talked about this. And while her main focus in her giving is education, part of the way they engaged her and built on that affinity with education, it was talking about how the Smith Center was going to make a difference for arts education and teachers and school kids here in the Valley. And so there's actually part of the building is named for Elaine Wynn. Guess what? The capacity and affinity came together in that case. And so there is actually, and a lot of the stuff that they do around education is supported by the Elaine Wynn Foundation. The other thing to consider is whether you have the capacity to do this yourself. If you're just a 1 or 2 person shop, and if you don't have a full-time fundraiser, maybe you want to hire a consultant. Because again, this usually requires building a database, spending time digging into potential donors. And again, you also want to think creatively. You know, not everybody can ask Elaine Wynn for money, but there are some sort of mid-level donors and lower-level donors that mid-level to just under those mega donors that have capacity that aren't approached as often. So how do you get access to some of those networks? How do you engage them? So for example, in the arts, again, arts has been tied to mental health benefits. Maybe you want to think about how to reach out to the mental health community and some of the professionals around that area that might be supportive of your mission, especially if you can make that case to them, right? Okay, questions. I went a little faster at the end because we had some technical difficulties at the beginning.
I will allow everyone to come in and talk right now, and then I will also throw those resources in the chat.
And I will send an updated thing to Erica without the duplicate slides so she can share with everybody after.
These have been so amazing, by the way.
Thank you. I was like, I'm never perfect. It's just the way it is. But I also think that's can be endearing, right? I say in teaching that being not perfect is also a learning thing.
I just put in that resource into the chat and wanted to say again, thank you all for your patience with our technical troubles today. But does anyone have any questions?
Okay. The other thing I want to mention, and is AFP, the Association for Fundraising Professionals, is a great resource around fundraising, and you can join, and it's a good way to get started with sort of the more professional aspects of fundraising. And they actually have, resources to learn more about fundraising. Our local chapter here in Southern Nevada is very active, and I believe the one in Northern Nevada is pretty active as well. Question, are there any nonprofits you think are doing external engagement well? Three Square does a great job here in Southern Nevada. That's our food bank. They're kind of everywhere. They have really good branding and marketing, and have built a lot of partnerships, both with food providers around what we call food rescue. So that's food that would get thrown away that they can then, very quickly move out. To have resources where we can find donors. I really think cultivating donors is about networks, right? That there are databases you can buy and access for donors, but it's also about that personal connection, and that's what cultivation is really about. And so you want to think about who who has the capacity, right? Or who who knows somebody who has the capacity, who might also have affinity. And you kind of have to work through it and build it over time. Which orgs in Nevada do you think do fundraising events well? I don't go to a ton of them. I think the ones that are the best are the ones that are on mission. Again, I actually volunteer at this one every year, and it goes really well. The Girl Scouts here locally, again, my daughter's a Girl Scout, so she and I both volunteer. They actually put the girls front and center at the event. It's dessert before dinner, so they choose one of the Girl Scout cookies every year and ask local female chefs to create desserts around those cookies. It's completely decadent and over the top, but the girls are actually present all night. They're volunteering. They help with the silent auction. They do the Girl Scout Pledge of Promise. Like, they're kind of put throughout the entire event. My daughter always seems to be stuck working the photo booth as a human prop. I think because she's kind of cute. And so we end up doing that. But she's also a little shy, so she's not good at the talking part. But they train. They do a whole evening of training with the girls the night before. They get to see the room. They get to get comfortable. They break them into groups. They give them all sorts of feedback and resources. And by the way, it's super hard to say no to a 9-year-old girl who's asking you for money if you have capacity to give. And again, it's a really fun event. But like I said, it puts the purpose of the mission, which is the girls front and center, and then ties into their branding around cookies, ties into their branding around entrepreneurship and girl empowerment by having the girls sort of active and part of that. I'm trying to think of some arts ones I've been to that I thought were done really well. And again, most of the arts things I've gone to are more like outreach events or community engagement events, like First Friday in Las Vegas. And again, that one has grown a lot over time. When I first went, it was a terrible event. The lighting was bad. Their transportation was bad. Downtown Las Vegas back then was pretty rough. Over time, the growth of it has made it a much better event. And they partnered with local governments and a lot of other and downtown vendors to make that event bigger and more engaging and feel safer and more welcoming to people that went down there. I first went to it 15 years ago when I moved to Nevada, and it was, like I said, it felt a bit sketchy. But over time, again, they've kind of built a bunch of relationships to support that, which means bringing food trucks and vendors and engaging local restaurants and things that make it a much more fun event. But I also think you should go to other people's events and see what you like and what you don't like. I'm not a professional fundraiser, but I think that that's one way you really learn what works. And you get to see, and again, maybe you invite them to yours and you they invite you to yours, or maybe you have a board member, and that board member has a table and they're willing to let you fill a seat. I used to get invited to a bunch of these events when I was new to town. I was a really good seat filler for a little bit.
I really like that advice to go to events, because in the arts, we all need to do that. And then you meet so many more people, get the outreach, and then figure out how to make that to your brand.
I also think in the arts, there's a lot of ability to partner on events to sort of, cross brand or do some marketing around that. So, for example, if your First Friday, you could invite performing arts groups to be part of your event. So they can gain attention and visibility. And it also, again, makes your event more fun. Or I've seen some museums do sort of cross marketing with DEI groups. So again, maybe your normal market is very white, middle class, not very diverse, but you want to do something around Black History Month or Latin heritage. And so partnering even with a human service that works in that area to sort of bring in a different group and to bring in a different perspective can also be a really creative way to sort of broaden out your market and engage a different audience. Anything else? No? Okay. Well, I just, again, thank you all for your time and attention. Again, I know you're all so busy, and so it means a lot to me that you take the time to listen to me for an hour every couple of weeks. And again, I just hope it's really helpful. And if you have questions or things you want to follow up with me, I'll leave my email here in the chat again. Nobody's taken me up on this yet.
Oh, y'all need to take up Jessica on this. You are such a wealth of information. Thank you so much for doing these 3 webinars with us. And if anyone here needs to reference them, they'll be up on our YouTube channel with the resources in the link. And of course, you can reach out to Jessica or myself, and I'll put my email in the chat as well. And then we'll say goodbye for this series. So thank you all.
Thank you, guys.
Bye.